Spring Boot is a way to get up and running with Spring applications really quickly. So it gives you a really good getting started experience with Spring Boot. And not just that, once you've started developing your Spring Boot applications, there are a lot of development time features that Spring Boot gives you out of the box to make your development experience really smooth. But as an application developer, the hope is that if everything goes well, you want to deploy your application to production. That's the place where hopefully most applications end up eventually. And once you're done developing your Spring Boot applications and you're ready to deploy to production, there are a bunch of features that Spring Boot provides to help you maintain and manage that application in production. So in today's talk, we are going to cover some of those production-ready features that Spring Boot offers for those applications running in production. So first, we look at Actuator endpoints. This is a dependency that you can add to your application, which you can use for monitoring and debugging the application that's running in any environment. Next, we look at externalizing your configuration and how you can switch on various configuration values in different environments using profiles. And the last thing we'll look at in this talk is metrics and what Spring Boot provides so that you can observe and react to your application's metrics over time. Before we get started with the actual demo, I am going to give you a quick overview of the demo application that we'll be using. So if you've ever heard of starterspring.io, it's this website that you can use to get started with Spring Boot applications really quickly. It's a website that's built by the Spring team itself. And it's a really nice way to generate Spring Boot applications and get the right structure for your Spring Boot applications. Now, because this is such a widely used tool all over the world, on the Spring team, we like to collect some anonymized data about the usage statistics of how people are using starterspring.io to generate projects, what kind of projects they're generating. And these statistics, they help us on the Spring team, they help us tune and improve starterspring.io so that we can better serve our users' needs. So in today's talk, we will be looking at a demo application that sort of shows these project generation statistics in a dashboard application. So the dashboard application is something that that will be a demo application that's going to be deployed to production. And this dashboard application talks to 3 external services. So obviously, we're not going to use real data from starterspring.io, but we do have a backend application that simulates these 3 services. So the dashboard application talks to a service that gives you the data, the statistics about generated projects, what kind of projects were generated. There's another service called events, which can give you calendar events so that you can do some sort of correlation between something that happened that week and whether the number of generated projects went up or down. And then there's a third service that gives you the list of top IPs that were generated from the project. And this can sort of help you see if there's a CI server running that's constantly hitting your service and things like that. So a quick look at what that dashboard looks like. So it's going to talk to the 3 services that we spoke about. You can sort of see that from the graphs that it's showing you the number of projects created this week. And these are the top IPs that the projects were generated from. The other thing that the dashboard application does is, because we don't just want to show the IP address, and we also want to show the actual resolved host name for that IP, the dashboard application also hits another service called the reverse lookup service. So that's just the demo application that we are going to be using today. And that's an overview of that. So as you can see, this came from the event service, the Twitter down, and the number of projects generated increased. I guess everybody became productive all of a sudden because Twitter was down. Obviously, this is dummy data, so Twitter wasn't actually down. Right. So the first thing we look at is actuators. And whenever I talk about actuators, I like to use this definition because I only learned about what an actuator means maybe last year. And that was long after I actually started working on the Spring Boot team. So in the real world, an actuator is a manufacturing term that refers to a mechanical device for moving or controlling something. And in Spring Boot, you have the actuator, the Spring Boot actuator module. And when you add that to your Spring Boot application, you can monitor and manage your running application over either HTTP or JMX. So in today's talk, we'll focus more on the HTTP side of things. But again, if you're not exposing your actuators over HTTP, you can monitor it over JMX. Okay, so now let's dive into some code. So we have this dashboard application that I just showed you in the browser. Let's take a look at the dependencies for this application. So for getting the actuator endpoints that Spring Boot gives you out of the box, all you need to do is add this Spring Boot Starter Actuator module to your POM or your build.gradle or whatever you're using. And that will give you a set of built-in endpoints that you can then use to monitor your application. The thing I would like to mention is even when you add this module, when you add this dependency to your application, by default, the endpoints that are exposed over HTTP, there are only 2 endpoints that get exposed by default. And that's because the actuators can contain potentially sensitive information. We don't want to expose all that information till we know that you have secured those actuators as per your security model. So in order to see all the endpoints that are available out of the box with Spring Boot, you can set this flag called management.endpoints.web.exposure.include. And you can either set it to a list of values for the endpoints that you explicitly want to expose over HTTP, or you can set it to a wildcard value of star, which will give you all the actuators. So I've set it to star. And just taking a quick look at the security configuration that I have for these actuators, I'm using Spring Security. And with that, Spring Boot gives you these convenient request matchers with the endpoint request class that you can use to secure the endpoints that you wish to secure using Spring Security. So you can explicitly specify the endpoints. And so I want my info endpoint and health endpoint to be accessible to everybody, but for all the other actuator endpoints, I explicitly want to require a role of admin. Let's take a look at the health endpoint. So if you go to the root of the actuators, you can see a list of all the actuators that are available to you out of the box. That is the ones that you have exposed. Now, if I click on, let's say, if I go to Actuator Health, I can see that my application is up and running. So it tells me that, okay, my app is doing fine, but there isn't any additional information that it's showing me at this point. And this is again tied to the security reasons that I was talking about before. By default, we only expose the status in the health endpoint. But let's say you want to drill down into more details about what it actually means by what your app actually means when it says that it's healthy. And you can do that by, in your application.properties, setting some properties for your health endpoint. So there's a management.endpoint.health.show details flag. And I'm going to go with when authorized. What that means is if I am authorized, if I am authenticated as a user and I have the right roles, then show me all the details that the health endpoint can show. So let's restart the application. It should restart on its own because I have dev tools.
Hey, Madhura. Okay. Hey, Madhura. This is Bob.
Yeah.
Could you make your font a little bit bigger?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Some people are asking for that. So thank you so much.
Sorry about that.
You're doing great.
Let's see. I think there's a way to. Hopefully that's better.
Yes, that definitely seems to be better. Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, this is the property that I just set. And let me see if I can make this better. So now if I refresh the health endpoint, instead of just the status up, I can see additional information from my health endpoint. The way the health endpoint works is that there are a bunch of health indicators available in your application. And by default, we have something like the disk space health indicator. And depending on other things you've got configured in your application, you can have let's say a Redis health indicator. The ping health indicator is a very simple one. It just gives you a status of what it would mean to give what it would mean when you ping your application. So that one's a simple one. And then the reverse lookup health indicator that you see here. So this is a custom health indicator that we've added in this dashboard application. And this is a good example of, let's say your application talks to some external service and you want to see how that is doing and how your app is responding in response to that. You can add custom health indicators based on your need and make it return things based on what that external service returns. Or even if it's not talking to an external service, the custom health indicator can build a status based on things that it knows about specifically. The other thing that I wanted to show you with the health endpoint was, I think in it was Spring Boot 2.2, where we added support for health endpoint groups. So you might want to group these health indicators based on certain requirements that you have. And let's say in our example, we don't want to look at the health based on the external services that the application is talking to, but we just want to get a focused view of the health of the application based on what is available locally for the application. So there's a property called management.endpoint.health.group, which lets you create a health endpoint group. And there's a bunch of, so I'm going to name it local. And there's a bunch of, there's a list of health indicators that you can include in this group. So let's say I want to include just the disk space and the ping health indicators. So if I run that now, and go back here, you can see that the health endpoint now shows me that a group called local was added. And I can actually go and just hit local to see what that focused view for that set of health indicators looks like. So again, this is showing you just up, but there are some properties that you can set to expose more details for the group. You can do local dot let's say, show components. So it'll show you all the components that are included in this group. Or you can do something like the show details that we've done above, and then set it again to when authorized, or something else that you want to set it to. So that's a little bit about the health endpoint and some of the new features that we added in Spring Boot 2.2 and later. There are a bunch of other actuators that we saw here. So let's look at some other ones that might be interesting. So Env is another interesting one, and I've personally seen it being used quite a bit when an application is deployed somewhere, let's say to a PaaS or to Kubernetes, and you want to see what your Spring environment looks like, because sometimes there might be property sources getting added to the application, adding properties that configure your application in different ways, and you don't really know which property is kicking in. So the endpoint really helps you drill down into which property is being set by what property source, and helps you debug why certain properties aren't appearing as you expected them to. We look a bit more at the endpoint when we get to the configuration section of the doc. The other one I wanted to show you was the loggers endpoint. This one is particularly interesting because not only does it show you the list of loggers that are available and their configuration that's available in your application, it actually lets you change your logger level for the logger at runtime. So let's say you discover that there is that your application isn't behaving the way you expected it to behave. The loggers endpoint will help you maybe turn on debug logging for a particular logger and see some of the debug logs without having to restart your application. And I can actually show you that in practice. So we have this reverse lookup client, which talks to that reverse lookup service, which gets from the IP, it gets the host name that we display on the dashboard. And it has some debug logging turned on. And right now, you don't see any of this in the logs, any of this being logged, because if we look at let's say I search for reverse lookup client, the log level for this class is set to info. So we won't see any of the debug logging. But let's say I want to debug that client. I can actually hit my loggers endpoint. It's going to be a post, and you need to give it the name of the logger that you want to configure and the configured level that you want to set the log level to. So if I execute that request, that's successful. And without restarting my applications, if I just refresh my loggers endpoint, I should be able to see that the reverse lookup client now has a configured level of debug. And let's say I were to hit my, I'm going to zoom out for this one. Let's say I were to hit my service now. I can see, I should be able to, in my logs, see the debug logging from that class. And it's calling this free reverse lookup service. And we also have this thing called the paid lookup service that gets called if, let's say, a free lookup service is very slow. And right now it's not slow, so our paid one is not getting called. But we can, let's say the free reverse lookup service starts being really slow and you haven't configured any timeout for the free lookup service calls, you'll see that the paid reverse lookup service would be logged in here. Okay, so in terms of actuators, I think the other thing that I wanted to quickly mention was that we do have documentation for all of the actuator endpoints that Spring Boot provides out of the box. So it's available on the docs.spring.io site. And you can go and look at the response structure for each actuator endpoint and look at the ones that you're interested in. moving on. This is just a quick recap of the web endpoints that we covered briefly. By default, when you add the Spring Boot Actuator dependency to your application, all the web endpoints are grouped under the /actuator base path. And this is done so that they don't clash with any of the other paths that you might have configured in your application. You can change it if you want by setting a property, but this is the default. Like I mentioned, only the health and info endpoint will be available by default for security reasons, but you can turn on the actuators that you wish to be available over HTTP using the management.exposure.include property. Management.endpoints.web.exposure.include. All right, so our next section that I wanted to cover is configuration. Now, when you're deploying your application to various environments, so let's say you have the application running in development versus you then deploy the application to a staging environment, and then you eventually get your application to production, you might want to have different configuration for that application depending on the environment that is running in. So this section will cover what it means to externalize that configuration and separate it from code so that you can have the same application code running in different environments. The first thing I'd like to, before we look at actually externalizing the configuration, the first thing I would like to mention is configuration properties. And this is a really good way to expose your configuration as POJOs. So basically, let's actually look at the code for this one. In my dashboard application, I have a configuration properties class called dashboard properties. So what you do is you annotate that class with add configuration properties and you specify a prefix. So this is the prefix that you then use in, let's say, your configuration files or wherever you configure your properties. And anything that is under this prefix that matches these fields in this configuration properties class then gets bound to this class. And the dashboard properties then gets created as a bean, which you can inject like any other bean in places that you want to use it. So we are using the dashboard properties in the stats service. So if you look here, we have this stats service, which talks to all the external services that I mentioned before. And just like any other bean that gets injected into the service, we can inject the configuration properties into the stats service. So configuration properties are basically strongly typed beans. You can group them via prefix. So let's say you have various configuration options that you want to expose for your application, and there are some logical groups that make sense. You can group those properties using the prefix attribute of the configuration properties annotation. Starting with Spring Boot 2.2, we've added an easy way to get these configuration properties scanned. So you don't explicitly need to create the beans for them. You can add the add configuration properties scan annotation, and any configuration properties that are in your application, they will be picked up and registered as beans. Or if you don't want to enable automatic scanning, you can either explicitly declare them as beans or use the annotation at enable configuration properties. You can also have special rules on these configuration properties, and you can use the @validated example, @validated annotation to validate them. So once you have these configuration properties, how do you actually configure them? And Spring Boot lets you externalize your configuration so that it's separate from the code. Like I mentioned, you can run the same application code in different environments. So you have your Spring Boot application and you want to configure it. You can do that with configuration files. It can be .properties or .yaml files, whatever you prefer. Or let's say you can use system properties or environment variables or command line arguments. There are a bunch of other property sources that we will also pick up, but these are a few that I've mentioned here. All of these get read and they go into the Spring environment. So if you're familiar with the Spring environment, you can either do like an environment.get property and get the property. But if you have a configuration properties class, those properties automatically from the Spring environment, they get bound to those configuration properties. These property sources are ordered. So the command line arguments are going to take precedence over, let's say, something like an application.properties file or an application.yaml. So even if you have a property configured in your application.properties file, you can, when running the application, override that property via a system property or a command line argument or an environment variable. Now, when you run your application in various environments, let's say development or production, you might have a separate set of properties that you want to turn on in development versus what the values are in production. For example, if you're talking to a database in your development environment, let's say you're talking to a locally running database on your machine, but obviously when you push it to production, you don't want to talk to that local database, and you might have it talking to an actual database running somewhere else. So even if you've configured the string.datasource.url, which is the property used for talking to the database, to, let's say, a local value in your application.properties, you want to somehow be able to override this in your production environment. And you can do that with profiles. So back to the code. What I'm going to configure in this application that I have here is, like we saw before, we have this dashboard properties class with a timeout. That timeout is basically the timeout for the call to the free lookup service. So let's say the free lookup service starts being really slow, and you want to then, because the free one is that slow, you want to call the paid lookup service. We can change that, tune that timeout in production. So right now in development mode, the timeout is set to 10 seconds. We can see that actually in action by making the free lookup service really slow. And I can change that by hitting this latency endpoint. That will deliberately slow down a percentage of the request to the free lookup service between 200 milliseconds and 8 seconds. So now if I go to my dashboard and let's say I were to refresh this page, you can see it's really slow and it's not really refreshing very fast. So in development, you might have a higher tolerance for this, but in production, you don't want your users to face the slowness. So what you could do is using the profiles feature, I'm going to add a new file called application-prod.properties. Sorry if my keyboard is loud. This is the only keyboard I had available at home. So what I would do is I have a dashboard. What was application dashboard? That looks right. Let me just look at the property again. So it's dashboard.reverseLookup.timeout. I'm going to set it to 500 milliseconds instead of 10 seconds. So my timeout tolerance is going to be much less. It's going to be much lower than 10 seconds. And then I'm going to, there's this option to turn on an active profile. I'm going to turn it on to prod. And what this does is, because I've told my Spring Boot application to turn on the prod profile, Spring Boot has this concept of profile-specific property files, which are, so it's basically it's like your application.properties, but prefixed with the, suffixed with the name of the profile that you want to apply these properties to. Now, if I run the app again, hopefully my prod profile is active. So you can see in the logs that the following profiles are active: prod. And now if I go back here, it should hopefully be much faster than, yeah, there we go. And that's because we are capping the timeout for the free lookup service at 500 milliseconds. Any request that takes longer than that is then going to be canceled, and it's going to go to the paid lookup service. So now we can actually look at that env endpoint that I was talking about before, because we've configured this property source in this property in a different property source. So as you can see, the env endpoint will show you what profiles are active, and it will show you the list of property sources that are available in your application. The one that we just added was this application-prod.properties, and it will tell you exactly where this property comes from. So with the origin support, it actually even tells you the line number in your properties file. So it's pretty easy to debug something that, let's say, you configure a property and you expect it to take effect in your application and it's not. You can go to the env endpoint and see if there's another property source that is overriding that property. All right, so just a recap of profiles. It's a good way to segregate your application configuration depending on which environment you want to run your application in. You can also, so I just showed you an example of profile-specific property files, but you can also use the profile annotation on, let's say, configuration classes or beans that you want to create only in a specific profile. Profile-specific property files, we just saw those. One thing I'd like to mention is that profile-specific property files, they take precedence over regular property files, which is why our application-prod.properties showed up higher than our application.properties in the env endpoint. And when I activated the profile via my IDE and I just input the value of prod, you probably won't do that. You obviously won't do that in a production environment because you won't do it by an IDE. You could set the spring.profiles.active property and with a list of active profiles that you want to activate. Okay, how much time do we have? We have a few minutes, and I wanted to quickly talk about metrics, because when an application is deployed, you probably want to observe how your application is operating and react to certain application metrics over time. And for this, for application metrics, Spring Boot provides dependency management and auto configuration for a project called Micrometer. So Micrometer is basically it's a metrics instrumentation library, but it's not just like any other metrics instrumentation library, because you can think of it as a facade over multiple monitoring systems, such as Datadog, Atlas, New Relic, Prometheus, and the list goes on. So with the integration of Spring Boot and Micrometer. Spring Boot actually enables you to choose a metrics backend without having to really change. And let's say you decide to change that metrics backend in the future, you don't really need to change any of the code for your custom metrics. And let's look at an example that I've got running here. So you get this with the Spring Boot Actuator dependency, and depending on the registry implementation that you've added to your class path, the appropriate backend registry will be configured. So in this demo, I'm using Prometheus, and when Spring Boot finds Prometheus on the class path, it's going to configure an Actuator endpoint for Prometheus to scrape data from. So I do have Prometheus running locally in the background, and it's scraping the Prometheus Actuator endpoint. I also have a dashboard to display the data that Prometheus is collecting, and it is a Grafana dashboard. So we're going to look at, actually before we do that, let's generate some traffic so that we can look at some metrics. One more time. So this is the dashboard that I have running locally again, which is getting the data from the Prometheus data source, which collects metrics from the Spring Boot application. If you want to play around with Grafana, you can also get this dashboard from the grafana.com website, and the dashboard is available under JVM Micrometer. So you can actually set it up yourself. There are some default metrics that are available out of the box with Micrometer, and those include some JVM metrics. So you can see things like CPU usage, file descriptors. You can see the number of classes loaded and unloaded. I won't go into details of each of them, but I just wanted to give you an overview of all the different metrics that are available by default. If you have, let's say, something like a REST template or a web client being used in the application, you can, Spring Boot will also instrument the REST template and the web client. So you can see which request is maybe taking a long time, or what the average latency is per endpoint. And you can also set up, customize your dashboard to include other things. So in here, you can see that the yellow line is the calls to the free service. So there are a few calls to the free service, and there are some calls to the paid service. That's because we've introduced that latency for the free service. Let's say I were to remove that latency for the free service, we would see that the number for the paid service is dropping down quite a bit because the free service is behaving as we expect it to behave. You can also, with Micrometer, you can also add custom gauges, custom metrics. And over here, we've actually added a custom gauge. This basically tells you how many calls you have remaining to the free lookup service. And it's a rate limiting thing that we've simulated in the demo application. So this is a custom metric that's been added, which is added as a gauge. The other thing that's interesting to look at is, let's look at the max time per endpoint. So we can see that the free service, it's taking about 356 milliseconds over here, the max time for that one. And a few other calls to all the endpoints that our dashboard application is hitting. So Micrometer can actually give you a lot of insight into your application, and you can configure your dashboard or the the tool that you're using to display these metrics in a pretty flexible manner. So like I said, Micrometer, it's a metrics instrumentation library. You get dimensional metrics. So all those metrics are, they have tags. So you can actually drill down into each metric based on the tags. It's a facade over multiple monitoring system. What that means is that your application doesn't necessarily, application code doesn't need to know about which backend system these metrics are being exported to, and you can change that without having to change any of your custom metrics. And also you can register custom metrics. So that's all I wanted to share with you today. And if you have any questions, please ask on the Q&A. I will be around for some time, but if I'm not there, there will be other folks available to help answer questions.